What would you do if you had spent your whole life hiding your body inside clothes 2 sizes too big, arrived at the most dangerous man's house in a shapeless grey dress, chosen so that nobody would look at you, and he crossed the room, took your hand, drew you gently against him in front of every powerful person there, quietly enough that only you could hear, and clearly enough that the whole room understood that you were perfect. She had bought that dress for one purpose. It had no shape at all, and that was the point, because a shapeless dress is a kind of armor, and she had worn versions of it since she was 19. She had planned to stand near a wall, do the work she was hired to do, and leave without anyone looking directly at her. And instead, the most feared man on the coast had walked the length of a room and had not looked at the dress once, and had said the 2 words she had spent 20 years believing were not available to a woman like her. This is a story of hidden worth, of a woman who had made herself into a shadow on purpose, and of the ruthless man who saw through the fabric to the extraordinary thing underneath. Mina Solano had spent her adult life perfecting the art of not being looked at. She was 33, soft and generously curved, with a quiet face and watchful eyes, and a wardrobe consisting almost entirely of loose dark clothing that told the world nothing about the shape of her at all. It had started at 19, at an aunt's wedding, in a dress she had loved, when a family friend looked her up and down and said in front of everyone that a girl her size should be careful what she draws attention to, and the table laughed and moved on, and Mina never wore anything fitted again. 14 years of it. She had built a whole life inside those clothes, and had come to believe the armor was simply who she was. What none of the people who slid their eyes past her ever bothered to discover was what Mina actually was, which was one of the finest noses in the country. She was a perfumer. Not a counter girl, though she had worked counters, but a trained nose, apprenticed at 17 to an old man with a laboratory above a flower market who had recognized something in her that no one else ever had. She could take a fragrance apart in the air the way other people take apart a chord, name 40 materials from a single pass, tell you which house had made a scent and roughly which decade, and identify a person by what their soap and their tobacco and their laundry had left on them. She remembered scent the way other people remember faces, permanently and without effort, and she had spent years being paid modestly to formulate other people's fragrances in clothes designed to make her disappear. And on the night everything changed, she was hired to build a bespoke fragrance for the household of the most dangerous man on the coast, and she put on the grey dress and went. The man was Cyrus Belmonte, and he was the reason rooms had temperatures. He was tall and broad and dressed in charcoal, cut with lethal precision, the head of a syndicate that owned the ports and the freight lines, and the fear of every powerful family for 100 miles, and he was rumored to end a life with a single unhurried nod. He rarely raised his voice, he never needed to, and he had a thing about scent that nobody in his organization understood and he had never explained, which was that his mother had worn a fragrance discontinued for 20 years, and he had, in a manner he found faintly ridiculous, been quietly trying to have it recreated ever since. 3 perfumers had tried. All 3 produced something pleasant and wrong. And on the night in question, a 4th had come to the house, a woman in a grey dress who stood near a wall and said almost nothing, and who had asked to smell the empty bottle. She held it for a long moment. Then she said without ceremony that there was iris root in it, a great deal of it, which was expensive and unfashionable, and the reason the others had missed it, and that underneath was a green note that was not galbanum, as everyone assumed, but violet leaf, and that the whole thing was built around a base banned in the 1990s, which was why nobody could reproduce it, but that she thought she could get within a hair of it with 3 materials in combination. Cyrus Belmonte set down his glass. Nobody in 15 years had told him anything he did not already know. and a woman in a shapeless dress had taken his mother apart in 90 seconds from an empty bottle and told him the truth, which was that what he wanted was illegal, and she could get him most of the way there anyway. He asked her name twice because he had not been listening properly the first time. He hired her that night. And the thing that Mina Solano did not understand for weeks was that the most feared man on the coast had spent the entire evening being unable to stop watching a woman who had arranged herself specifically so that nobody would. He watched her work over the following month in a laboratory he had built for her in 3 days, and he noticed everything. He noticed that she moved differently when she thought she was alone, and that when someone came in, her shoulders came up and forward, a small reflexive folding of herself that he recognized because he had seen it in men who had been hit. He noticed she wore the same shape in 6 colors. He noticed that she never once in a month sat with her back to a door or stood in the middle of a room. And Cyrus Belmonte, who read people because his life depended on it, understood that somebody had done something to this woman long ago, and that she had built a house out of it and had been living in it ever since. He did not say any of that. What he did instead was ask her questions and then wait for the answers, which nobody had done since the old man above the flower market died. He learned she could tell him what a man had eaten and where he had been from a handshake, and that she hummed while she blended and stopped the instant she noticed. And he found himself walking down to that laboratory at unreasonable hours to ask her about materials he did not care about, and the walls he lived behind came down. Then came the reception and the grey dress. It was a formal thing, 300 people, and she had been asked to come. Because the fragrance was finished, and he wanted her there, and she had spent 2 days quietly panicking and had bought the most invisible dress she could find. She stood near a wall, and Cyrus Belmonte crossed the room. He did not comment on the dress. He stopped in front of her and said quietly, "May I?" And Mina, who had never once in her life been asked, did not know what she was agreeing to and said yes anyway, and he took her hand and drew her gently in against him, one hand at her back, in front of 300 people, and said, low, near her ear, "You have spent every second of this evening trying to be furniture." And Mina Solano, folded against the chest of the most dangerous man on the coast, in a dress chosen to hide her, said very quietly, "It is easier." And Cyrus said, "You are perfect." He said it plainly, the way a man states a fact. He is tired of no one else noticing. Then he added, "So only she could hear it. Whoever told you otherwise was small, and they have been living in your head rent-free for a very long time, and I would like permission to evict them." And the room, which had watched the whole thing, understood exactly what it had seen, and the temperature of Mina Solano's entire life changed in about 9 seconds. She did not become a different woman overnight. But something began over the following weeks that she had not expected, which was that she stopped folding. He never once told her what to wear. He simply kept treating her in public and in private as the most interesting person in any room. And it turned out that being looked at by someone who is not looking for a flaw is an entirely different experience. And after a while, Mina found herself standing straighter, and then, one day, buying a coat that fit. Every evening they sat over a decanter of amber whiskey he poured for himself, and a glass of wine he poured for her, and he told her about the mother whose scent he could not reproduce, and about the father he had buried, and the trust he had learned to bury with him, things he had said to no one. And one night at her door, his hand rose to cradle her jaw, his thumb brushing her cheek, and he said, "Tell me to stop." And Mina, who had spent 14 years making herself unlookable, said, "Do not," and he murmured good night into her hair like a man saying something sacred, preciosa. But Mina, being Mina, had smelled something in that house that did not belong, and it would not let her rest. The cruelty came at a formal gathering, and it arrived beautifully dressed. Cyrus had brought Mina in a gown of deep burgundy, the first fitted thing she had worn in 14 years, and she had been standing straight in it for almost an hour when a sleek, beautiful woman named Verity, who had spent 2 years positioning herself to become the next Mrs. Belmonte, cornered her by the tall windows with an audience in tow. "Oh, look at you," Verity said brightly, loud enough for the room, letting her eyes travel over Mina's body with theatrical sympathy. "Someone has been shopping." She smiled like a blade. "It is brave, sweetheart, but you must know what this is. He is a man with a peculiar hobby, and you make him something that reminds him of his mother, and that is a very particular kind of attachment, and not the kind you are hoping for. When the novelty wears off, he will want a woman built for this room, and nobody, and I do mean nobody, looks at a girl who has spent her whole life hiding in a sack and sees a queen. Do put the old dress back on." The temperature in the room dropped 20 degrees, and the old miner would have folded, apologized for the burgundy, and gone home. But something had been rebuilt in her, and she did not lower her eyes. "You are right that I hid," Mina said, her quiet voice carrying with perfect clarity. "For 14 years, because a man at a wedding told me to when I was 19, and I believed him, which is the only genuinely embarrassing thing in this story." She tilted her head. "And while I was busy being invisible, I was also standing close to a great many people who did not notice me, which is how I know things." She let that settle. "For instance, Verity, you changed your fragrance 3 months ago, and what you are wearing tonight is not sold in this country. It is made by a small house on the other side of the water, and I know of exactly 2 people on this coast who wear it, and the other is not a friend of this family. So be careful whose sack you comment on. She has an extremely good nose." The silence had teeth. Verity went white and left the room, and Cyrus, who had crossed the floor in silence, took Mina's hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles in front of the entire gathering. "You never make yourself small in this house again, Preciosa," he murmured. "Not in my world, and never in front of me." But past Verity's shoulder, a man who had stood at Cyrus Belmonte's right hand for 18 years had gone very still, because he had been wearing the same fragrance for 3 months, and the perfumer had just told a room full of people that she could name it. The man was Bartolo, Cyrus Belmonte's consigliere, and he had been undone by something no one on earth could have anticipated. For 2 years, Bartolo had been meeting the head of a rival house across the water, and he had been faultlessly careful about it. No calls, no documents, no pattern in his movements. He met the man 3 or 4 times a year, in person in a private room in another country, and he had never once left anything behind that could be found by anybody. What Bartolo did not know, because almost nobody does, is that a private room where 2 men sit for 3 hours does not let you leave unchanged. Scent transfers. It gets into wool, sits in the fibers of a coat for days, and in the lining for weeks, and a man who embraces another in greeting, as those 2 did, walks out, wearing a trace of him. Bartolo had also, in the way of a man impressed by wealth, begun wearing the same expensive fragrance as his new associate, because it smelled to him like the life he was buying. It was made in a town of 4,000 people and sold in 11 shops in the world. And Cyrus Belmonte had hired into his own house a perfumer who had catalogued every fragrance she had ever encountered since she was 17, and who had smelled that fragrance for the first time in the corridor outside the study, and had thought, with mild professional interest, how strange, and had never once stopped thinking about it. Bartolo smiled, thin and cold, and began, very quietly, to plan. It was the last mistake he would ever make as a free man. Mina brought it to Cyrus that night, and she brought it the way she brought everything, carefully, and with the certainty of a woman who did not guess about scent but knew it. She had not been able to let it go, so she had done what she always did, which was to work the problem. The fragrance Bartolo had begun wearing 3 months ago was, she said, from a house she could name, in a country she could name, and it was not exported here at all, which meant he had bought it there or been given it. That alone was nothing. But 3 times in 11 weeks, she had come into a room shortly after he left it and smelled something under his own scent that was not his. A distinctive tobacco absolute. She had encountered exactly twice in her career, the second time on a man at a trade fair 3 years ago. She had recognized it instantly, the way anyone recognizes a voice. And when she had gone back through her own diary, because a perfumer keeps a diary of everything she smells, she found she had noted the anomaly on 3 separate dates, and every one of those dates was within a day of a trip Bartolo had taken. She laid it out on the table without drama, in order, 3 dates, 1 fragrance, 1 man, and... Cyrus Belmonte went very still, and then he did the thing that undid her completely. He believed her instantly. He did not ask her twice. He did not send a man with a title to verify what a perfumer had said. He looked at a case built entirely out of a tobacco note in a corridor, assembled by a woman who had spent 14 years standing near walls so that no one would look at her, and said, quietly, "Bartolo?" "Yes," said Mina. Then he took her face in his hands and said, "If I move on him, and he sees it coming, he will not come at me. He will come at you, because there is no document to burn, and no recording to destroy, and the only evidence in the world is inside your head," and neither of them knew that Bartolo had already made that decision. The house went dark at 2:30. Mina was in the laboratory because she had not been sleeping and had stopped pretending she would, and the power died and took the extraction fans and the lights with it, and every instinct, 14 years of making herself unnoticeable, had honed, screamed that something was catastrophically wrong. Cyrus had been drawn out at midnight to a meeting she now understood was a fabrication, and Mina, standing in the dark among 400 bottles, knew with terrible certainty that they had come while he was away, and that they had come for her because she was the evidence. She did not scream, she did not faint, she did not run blindly. She thought, cold and clear, the way she always had over a formula that was not working when panic would have ruined it. 2 floors below, a door came in, and Mina Solano did the thing that no one in that house, friend or enemy, had ever thought to account for, because she was standing in the one room in that building that was, to a person who understood it, a weapon. She did not go for the door. She went to the bench where the wired line ran on its own circuit and got one message out. Then she used what she had. She took the 96% alcohol every perfumer works in, went into the corridor outside the laboratory and poured a wide band of it across the floor and up the walls, then took the 2 most aggressive materials on her shelves, the ones every trained nose treats with respect, opened them and set them in the middle of it, and went back inside and shut the door and put a wet cloth along the bottom. And then she waited in the dark, in the one place in that corridor where the extraction duct would still be pulling air even with the fans dead, because she had spent a month in that room and she knew exactly which way the air moved in it. The men came up the stairs and into the corridor and walked straight into a wall of it. It was not gas. It was worse in a way, because it was not lethal and did not announce itself as an attack. It was simply an atmosphere so overwhelming that a person who breathes it cannot see, cannot smell anything else, cannot think, and starts, involuntarily, to weep. 2 of them went to their knees. A third turned and went back down the stairs with his hands over his face. And Mina Solano, standing behind a door with a wet cloth at the bottom of it in the one pocket of clean air in that wing, listened to a professional crew come apart in a corridor because a woman had understood how a building breathes. And then she heard the unhurried footsteps of Bartolo, who had come up behind them with a scarf across his face. "Mina," he said, muffled and pleasant into the dark. "Clever girl." He was moving carefully. "Do you know, I have spent 2 years being more careful than any man in this organization. Nothing written, nothing said on the telephone. 4 meetings in 3 years in another country, in a room with no windows." He coughed and swore quietly. "And I've been undone by a smell," he laughed. "It is not even a real thing, is it? It is not evidence. You cannot photograph it. You cannot put it in front of a commission." That is what I have been telling myself for a week. And Mina Solano, standing in the dark with her heart steady and her hands steadier, did the one thing he never expected because she had never once been the harmless thing he took her for. "You are right that you cannot photograph it," she said. Silence. "But you can bottle it," she said. "I have a sample of what you were wearing in November, lifted off the back of a chair in the study, with a strip of odorless film, a technique that has existed for 40 years, which every perfumer knows and no criminal ever thinks about. I have a second from January and a third from March. They are in a bank vault, in sealed vials with dates on them, and there are 4 people in this country qualified to analyze them, and any one of them can tell a room full of families that the material in those vials is a tobacco absolute made by one house, and that it was on you 3 times within a day of you coming back across the water." She let it settle. "You were careful about everything a man can be careful about. You never once considered that you walk out of a room wearing it." Bartolo said nothing, which was the closest thing to a concession she would ever get. And in that silence, the gates below came inward with the tortured shriek of an engine pushed past its limits. Cyrus had come home. Time seemed to fracture. There was noise below, brief and brutal and absolute, and Bartolo turned toward it. And Mina, who had spent a month learning every inch of that wing and knew that the corridor he was standing in had a second door at the far end that opened into the drawing room, was already moving through it and through the store beyond and out into the stair, before he understood she had left the laboratory at all. And then the corridor flooded with light, and Cyrus filled it, soaked in rain, his eyes wild and searching. Otto, his loyal second, poured in behind him with a crowd of men, and the trap Bartolo had spent 2 years building closed around him instead, in a corridor where 2 of his own crew were still on their knees. Cyrus had him against the wall by the throat before he could speak. 18 years, he said. "You sold me across the water 4 times, and when a woman could smell it on you, you came into her laboratory for her." Then he turned his head, and the murderous cold in his eyes dissolved into raw, naked fear, and he released Bartolo to Otto's men and crossed to Mina in 2 strides. His hands moved frantically over her arms, her face, her shoulders, checking for any harm to what was his. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, his voice cracking. "Did he touch you? Look at me. Breathe. Tell me." "I am all right," Mina said. Steady even now, her eyes streaming and her fingers curled into his soaked coat. "I gassed a professional crew with civet and a great deal of 96% alcohol. 3 of them are crying in your corridor. It will smell like that until Thursday, and I am not apologizing." And Cyrus Belmonte let out a broken, disbelieving laugh into her hair, then framed her face in his shaking hands and looked at her the way no one in her whole overlooked life had ever looked at her. "You are extraordinary," he breathed. He met that man 4 times in 3 years on the other side of the world and left nothing behind, and you caught him from a corridor, and then his voice cracked open entirely. "Do you know what I understood? The night you stood by that wall in the grey dress," he said hoarsely. that the most remarkable person in the room had come dressed as a piece of furniture, and had done it so that nobody would look, and that it had worked on 300 people, and not for 1 second on me. He pressed his forehead to hers. "You are perfect." "Preciosa, I said it in front of everybody so that you could not decide later that I had not meant it." Bartolo, the man who had stood at the Belmonte family's right hand for 18 years while selling it across the water, learned the price of underestimating her before the week was out. Cyrus did not act in blind rage. He let Mina lay the whole of it before the families: 3 dated vials, 4 qualified analysts, 1 tobacco absolute from a house in a town of 4,000 people, and a diary kept since she was 17, all presented by a woman that world had slid its eyes past for 14 years. And when the families had seen it, and the rival house that had received him 4 times was exposed along with him, Mina did not counsel death. "You do not need to make him a martyr," she said quietly. "You need to make him nothing." So, they did it her way. They stripped Bartolo of every asset and exposed 2 years of it to the very house he had schemed to serve, and cast him out, alive, bankrupt, disgraced, and permanently famous for the manner of it, because the story spread across that coast within a month. And there is no coming back from being a joke. The old men agreed it was far worse than a quick end. And Verity, who had said that nobody looks at a girl who hides in a sack and sees a queen, found that the fragrance Mina had named so pleasantly by the windows was asked about in earnest by very serious people, and spent a long and humiliating season explaining an acquaintance she could not explain, and afterward watched from the far end of every table. Mina now sat at the head of P. Months later, on a bright morning washed gold with new sun, Mina Solano stood in a laboratory of her own with tall windows and 400 bottles in perfect order, and she did not hide any more. She wore rich colors cut to celebrate every curve she had spent 14 years concealing, and she stood in the middle of rooms, and she had thrown away every grey dress she owned except one, kept deliberately at the back of the wardrobe as a reminder of a house she used to live in and had moved out of. Cyrus came in and stopped, simply to watch her work. "You are staring," she said, without looking up from the balance. "I will never stop," he said, crossing to her. "Do you know what I understood, that first night with the empty bottle?" he said quietly. 3 of the finest perfumers in the country had told me what I wanted to hear, and a woman standing against a wall in a dress chosen to make her disappear told me that what I wanted was illegal and that she could get me most of the way there anyway. He lifted her hand from the bench and pressed his lips to her stained fingertips. "A man at a wedding told you to make yourself smaller when you were 19, Preciosa, and you did it for 14 years, and in all that time, nobody ever once thought to ask what you could do." She looked up at the man the whole city feared, who bowed to no one, and yet bowed entirely to her, and, for the first time in her life, she believed she was exactly enough. She had spent 14 years buying clothes designed to make the world slide its eyes past her, convinced hiding was the only safety available to a woman built like her, and she had proven every last small cruelty wrong because the gift the world never thought to ask about had saved an empire and a life. She had come to that house in a shapeless dress so that nobody would look at her. He had crossed the entire room and taken her hand and told her she was perfect in front of 300 people. And by the time his enemy understood what she was, the woman they had all looked past had taken his whole betrayal apart from a trace in the air. If Mina and Cyrus's story of hidden worth, quiet brilliance, and hard-won belonging moved you, if something in you lifted when the Mafia boss crossed that room and said you are perfect, then do us a small favor before you go. Smash that like button right now. Share this story with someone who needs to hear that the thing you were told to hide was never the problem. Subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss another twist-filled tale of the overlooked soul who finally gets everything she deserves. And drop a comment below and tell us, what was your favorite moment in Minna and Cyrus's story?